joining us. And I just want to, before I begin, want to let you know that this meeting is being recorded and will be posted on the Spark website when we are done. As you know, UW Spark has a mission of integrating both STEM and space law and policy. I'm Sadia Pekkanen. I represent more the law and policy pillar for Spark. My colleague and co-director, Christy Morganson, who is chair of ANA, represents the STEM side. And we are especially pleased to be able to introduce a person today who's sort of crossing the bridge between both STEM and law and policy. Before I introduce our speaker, let me just begin by thanking our sponsors, Salal Credit Union, which has a long history of funding and championing new industries, including industries like space. And I also want to acknowledge the Job and Gertrude Tamaki Endowed Professorship at the University of Washington as a sponsor. And also, of course, Amy Sprague for doing all the tireless work that she's always doing to put these things together. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Therese Jones, who's the Senior Director for policy at the Satellite Industry Association, which is a US-based trade association representing over 50 satellite operators. And prior to that, Therese was an assistant policy researcher at the RAND Corporation, and she sort of exemplifies what we are doing at UW Spark. Her training is really in astrophysics, and she is currently a PhD candidate in policy analysis at the Pardee RAND Graduate School, master's in astrophysics from the University of California, Berkeley, as well as an interdisciplinary training in astronomy and physics and German and international study from the Pennsylvania State University. She is going to be talking to us today about navigating government space policy, as you see there from her introduction. And so, Therese, welcome to UW Spark. It's a pleasure to have you with us, and I give the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to UW for inviting me to speak with you. Hope to eventually see you all in person at some point once the pandemic is over. So this is just a presentation that I put together because I didn't really realize how government space policy worked until I was really embedded in it in this current job. And the best way to describe my current job is sort of the industry liaison to the federal government. As Sadia mentioned, I represent about 50 different companies across the space industry, satellite-related companies, so everyone from SpaceX, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, to some remote sensing companies like Planet Spire, to ground equipment suppliers. So really a wide variety of space actors. And I'll tell you a little bit about interacting with the federal government from an outside capacity. So just to get started, this is a short overview of some of the main entities within the US government that deal with space policy. So we've got the Office of the President, Congress, obviously, Department of Defense, Homeland Security, State Department, the FCC, NASA, Department of Commerce, and FAA, I would say, are the main actors in space in the US government. So quite a few different moving parts. I'll go through all of them and tell you a little bit about how they impact space policy, and feel free to ask questions about these as well. So starting with the Office of the President, there are a few different offices within the Office of the President that deal with space policy. There's the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which deals a lot with science research, like the National Science Foundation is in there, makes high-level decisions about what direction science and technology policy in the government should go. The Office of Management and Budget, which decides how much funding different agencies get. US Trade Representative, so working on trade within the government. There's the National Security Council, which is impacted by space quite a bit from the communication side, from remote sensing and GPS. Under President Trump, we had the revival of the National Space Council. The chair was, or still is for the next few days, Mike Pence, and the members, are from a broad range across the federal government. You can see all the agencies listed there. To be determined if President Biden will keep the National Space Council together. I think in the space community, there's a lot of nonpartisan support for the Space Council as a whole. And I know he's got some good advisors on his transition team. And I think, broadly, people would really like this to keep existing because otherwise you have these really stovepipe decision makers that don't really come together and convene on dialogues of great importance to the space industry. There's also a user advisory group made up of different entities across industry that gave NASA and the National Space Council advice. The Space Council has been very active under President Trump, and they've come out with 6 different space policy directives. The Moon to Mars objective, so going back to the moon in theory by 2024 and onward to Mars. They had one on streamlining regulations, another on space traffic management. There's the creation of the Space Force. They had a space cybersecurity policy directive, and then they just came out with a space nuclear power and propulsion one. So really a lot of activity at a high level in this administration, and really activity that we haven't seen in quite a few years at the highest levels of the government. In talking with a couple people from the Biden transition team, they've been asking us as an industry to think about focusing on COVID, economic recovery, racial justice, and climate change as we think about policy challenges that the Biden administration should focus on. And that's sort of across all of the agencies that I've listed here that work on space. So there's a bit of a transition, I guess I would say, in emphasis, or it seems like there will be, from one that's more focused on human space exploration and some of the more difficult policy challenges in terms of organization within the federal government on space, to these more applied issues from the Biden team thus far. And this was sort of their first focus in the first couple months of the administration. We'll see what happens with these other policy directives. Oops. Okay. And then there's Congress as well as the legislative agencies. Congress funds all the executive branch agencies, so has a huge role to play for the space industry. The past 2 years, because the House and Senate were split, there really has not been much movement in any sort of legislation. We expect it, going into 2021 to be easier to approve budgets because you only need a majority in the House and Senate to approve a budget. But we don't think it will be super easy to pass legislation because of filibuster rules. You need at least 60 people in the Senate to prevent a filibuster. And right now, the Democratic majority is below that number. So we'll probably see some budget action funding, Biden initiatives and executive branch agencies, but much harder to make policy. I should say, though, the space industry has had a lot of nonpartisan support on a number of issues. So there will probably be some space legislation that's passed on a nonpartisan basis supporting the space industry, but the more partisan issues will be harder to pass. Congress can also call for the evaluation of different programs. They can change the mandate of executive branch agencies, and I'll go into some of the areas where that's been important recently later in this presentation. There's a Congressional Budget Office that looks at the funding of these agencies, as well as the Government Accountability Office, which evaluates different programs within these executive branch agencies and can make recommendations to Congress about funding or direction of these agencies. Okay, so most famous executive branch agency that some of you are familiar with space, NASA. NASA has broadly been shifting toward commercial partnerships. I don't think that's something that will hugely change under the Biden administration, just because the space industry is highly diversifying, and we've got a lot of new exciting commercial actors in space. NASA does provide funding mechanisms for research and technologies, not just within the scientific community, but also for companies to participate in space exploration. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that NASA is not a regulator. They can provide analysis that aids regulatory agencies, but they don't make rules that impact commercial companies unless they have a NASA contract. And then one of the other biggest users, well, the biggest user of space across the federal government is DoD. So you've got all of the military branches, and then they're split into combatant commands as well. They're a matrix organization. So you've got the military branches, and then you've got each of the people from the military branches in both these geographic and functional, what are called combatant commands. So they cover these different geographic regions: Africa, Central, European, Indo-Pacific, Northern, Southern. And then we've got these functional ones: cyber, space, special operations, strategic, and transportation. So it gets people from all the military branches that are focused on either those regions or those functions in one spot to talk about different issues. Then we've also got the intelligence agencies. There are 17 in total, particularly the CIA, NSA, National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, National Reconnaissance Office, Defense Intelligence Agency, as well as those for specific military branches really use space a lot, particularly remote sensing information, as well as they obviously use communications to get intelligence as well. Office of the Secretary of Defense works quite a lot on space, and also DARPA does advanced research projects for DoD, funds a lot of new technology initiatives. Some current hot topics are Space Force, space traffic management, interagency approval of remote sensing licenses, and diversification of space architecture. And I'll go into those each in more depth later in the presentation. Okay. So the Department of Homeland Security works closely with DoD. They use space assets a lot for missions such as monitoring smuggling, illegal fishing in international waters, Arctic missions. The Coast Guard actually has a mission in the Antarctic, which I didn't know until I was working on a project for DHS. So they're really interested in working with space assets for both Arctic and Antarctic as well. And that's particularly Arctic is an emphasis given the sort of military pivot to the Arctic right now. They also are responsible for defense of US assets against attacks, particularly cyber attacks. One area that's been a focus recently is potential for GPS outages, because there's an estimated loss of $1 billion per day in the US if we lose GPS, which could be, it could be due to an attack, it could be due to solar activity, but we really need to think about how to prepare for that. And it's everything from impacting the timing aspect of GPS, impacts utility services, the electrical grid, and it obviously impacts transportation and logistics. So really big loss if a GPS outage happens. And they also coordinate with industry for different critical infrastructure needs, including communications. So DHS has been really active on this front, particularly during COVID, to try and make sure Americans stay connected to the internet, whether that's terrestrial communications or satellite communications, particularly in rural areas, as well as for natural disasters. So anytime there's a major hurricane that might take out the terrestrial communications infrastructure, we interact with them a lot to try and get satellite communications down on the ground to people who need it, first responders, and then gradually build up the infrastructure on the ground again. State Department's also really active in space policy. It has a number of different bureaus that work on space policy, but one main way that we interact with them is they represent the US government as well as US industry at the UN level. So they work at the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which they have a technical subcommittee, a legal subcommittee that each meets once a year, along with a general assembly that meets once a year as well in normal times. And that's where a lot of issues on space law come up on an international level. They are a unanimous entity, or they require unanimity to pass anything. One of the major issues that they've been working on there has been on long-term sustainability of outer space and coming up with guidelines that different countries should follow and have stakeholders in their countries implement to preserve the outer space environment. Then there's a UN Institute for Disarmament Research, which is more on the arms race side. There's the International Telecommunications Union, which works on spectrum allocation at the international level. So the FCC is very involved with them. And they have an office for disaster risk reduction as well. So space applications, working on that both on the remote sensing side and communication side. And the State Department is also important because nation states are responsible for treaty compliance of their citizens for the Outer Space Treaty. So there's this UN level outer space treaty that talks a lot about broad space laws, things like things in space aren't subject to national appropriation. You have to register satellites or other things that you launch into space. State Department is responsible for making sure that private entities within the US comply with that as well. We interact with them on that front. FAA has an Office of Commercial Space Transportation. They cover launch and reentry. And they're responsible for payload authorization for anything that otherwise doesn't have to get a license from another US government entity. And interestingly, unlike the rest of the FAA, they have both a promotional and regulatory mandate. The FAA as a whole only is a regulator, but because the Office of Commercial Space Transportation has both this promotional and regulatory mandate, they are really supposed to promote US space flight and is impacted by things like there's a moratorium on safety regulations for passengers for commercial human space flight currently to encourage industry growth, which is not something that you see in the rest of the FAA. And I'm sure this office will continue to grow a lot as we hopefully have the first commercial, paid commercial human space flights in the next couple of years. The FCC is a huge player in the space industry. They are actually an independent agency, which means they make a lot of decisions without guidance from the executive branch, even though the commissioners are appointed by the executive branch. And they regulate any sort of non-governmental spectrum use. There's an organization that's the government counterpart, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, under the Department of Commerce, that covers government use. And anything that communicates with the ground from space needs an FCC authorization to launch if they're US based. And they file through the FCC for this application, and then they file through the ITU at an international level. So even things like remote sensing satellites, they need communications downlink to be able to downlink data. So they still have to go through the FCC. Current hot topics that I'll cover a bit later are the use of 5G and reallocating spectrum so that terrestrial communications can use 5G. Satellites also part of the 5G infrastructure, which I'll talk about later. Orbital debris, C-band use, which is a portion of the spectrum that has traditionally been used by broadcasters for satellite broadcasts. And then things like the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund that are supposed to provide internet access for people in rural America. And this is just a chart. You're not meant to actually read any of this, but this is just to show you how complicated the frequency allocations are that the FCC has to deal with. And I think I pulled this last year. I know it's been updated since, but it's a constantly changing environment, very complicated. And the FCC has to figure out how to more efficiently use all of this spectrum as new technologies come online. Okay. Then we got the Department of Commerce. They are supposed to promote US industry, and an office that's really become more prominent during this past administration has been the Office of Space Commerce. They are under NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which you may better know for weather forecasting. This administration wanted to elevate the Office of Space Commerce to be directly under the Secretary of Commerce. That didn't happen because they needed congressional authorization. I sort of doubt that under the Biden administration that will still happen, but we'll see. But the Office of Space Commerce has been working a lot with industry on different issues like commercial remote sensing regulatory reform and licensing of remote sensing satellites, which falls under NOAA. They've been working on space traffic management and orbital debris. They've been working on getting new stakeholders up to date on, the different processes that they have to go through to get licenses. Has been helping them find things like funding, but they've been a very productive office, even though they're quite small. NTIA, I already mentioned, which is the government counterpart of the FCC. So even if NASA wants to use Spectrum, they have to get an authorization through NTIA to use that part of Spectrum. And then there are a few other entities within Commerce as well that work on space. Bureau of Industry and Security works on export control issues, since a lot of space technologies are controlled due to potential use in weapons as well. Bureau of Economic Analysis has been, looking at the space economy. National Institutes of Standard and Technology, NIST, works on space technologies, and the International Trade Administration works on some bigger issues with, companies and international trade with regard to space. Okay, so I've talked about all these agencies. How do you make change as an outsider? If you're talking about a regulatory agency, they are required to put out what's called a notice of proposed rulemaking anytime they want to change any sort of regulations. Anyone can submit a response to that. There was an orbital debris notice of proposed rulemaking the FCC put out. The United Church of Christ even submitted comments to this because they feel that orbital debris is part of their environmental stewardship, interests. So that was kind of interesting to look at. I didn't realize they were interested in space debris. You can become part of a users advisory group in these different regulatory agencies. And in general, making change involves meeting with these different government entities. And they're usually very happy to take meetings. On the congressional side, they often ask for industry input prior to introducing any legislation regarding space. And the staff on relevant committees are usually happy to meet with you to talk about legislation or even just space technologies. If you're a student, they are very excited to talk to students in their district. And I know SEDS has done some congressional visits in the past for those of you who are in SEDS, as has AIAA. And I have this note: with great lobbying power comes things like, I have a colleague who in some legislation, early legislation regarding space traffic management and space situational awareness, got an earmark written in for millions of dollars for a university to have a space situational awareness research center. There was also a surprise communications satellite, a WGS satellite, that ended up in a bill because I guess Boeing had lobbied very heavily. Even though DoD didn't want more WGS satellites, Congress somehow funded them. But individual members of Congress have a lot of impact on what ends up in these bills. And how do you make change within DoD? It's generally pretty slow. Congressionally mandated studies are generally needed to make really big policy decisions. So it's usually a drawn out game. But I'll just go through a couple of hot topics in the next few minutes and then move on to questions. Sure, a lot of you have heard about Space Force. When it first came out, it was sort of being advertised in the media as Jedi for the US government. The initial problem, however, was that 60 different agencies do space acquisitions across the DoD and intelligence community. But they were really stovepiped and not communicating with each other and replicating a lot of work. So at my old job, I was getting paid to tell the Army what the Air Force was doing in space, because the Army was launching its own satellites, but had no idea what the Air Force was doing. And it just didn't really make sense to not have them talking. And this is where the Space Force came in. It used to be, really a nonpartisan issue. Everyone kind of recognized that we should put people in the same place to work on these issues. There was, really bipartisan support for what became Space Command to have these different people in one spot to work on space issues. There's just a question of whether it really needed to be a separate service or not, which with Space Policy Directive 4, it did become a separate service. It is unlikely to be reversed because it's already been enacted by Congress. So we'll see, how much Biden, how much effort Biden puts into the Space Force and what sort of mission the executive branch gives Space Force, but they're unlikely to dismantle it entirely since it already exists. I'll skip over acquisitions. It's not super exciting since we don't have too much time. I'll go into space debris though, because that's been another really hot topic. DoD has traditionally monitored space debris, and as of this past year, most of the satellites on orbit right now that are active are commercial, whereas previously they were primarily government. And just because of this huge explosion of commercial satellites, the DoD doesn't really think this is viable anymore for them to keep tracking all of these objects in space. And we have, I want to say it's 110,000 satellites that are set to launch by 2029, whereas there are only a couple thousand active satellites on orbit right now. So a huge explosion predicted. Probably all of those won't launch, but conservative estimate, maybe 25, 30% will. So really changing space environment. And with the DoD doing this orbital debris tracking, there was a lack of transparency for international actors in particular. Like Russia doesn't really want to trust DoD. Should this aspect move to a different part of the US government to make this process more transparent? It initially looked like the FAA might take over this role because they also do air traffic management. The Trump administration really wanted it to go to the Office of Space Commerce. And just last month, finally, after years of arguing where commercial space situational awareness was going, Congress decided to fund the Office of Space Commerce to work on this in concert with other agencies on the National Space Council, including NASA. So they're trying to put together what they're calling an open architecture data repository, where they're combining a lot of different space data and hopefully getting better information on what's out there in space and more actively working with commercial actors, both on the data aspect, improving data, but also on the coordination in the event that there's a potential conjunction for space debris. The FCC is also working on this issue, as I mentioned before, and they're more concerned with making regulations that will prevent the creation of debris by regulating, what technical parameters satellites are allowed to launch with. And also they have talked about things like requiring a bond that companies will have to pay for before they launch, and then will be refunded if they successfully deorbit or dispose of their satellite in a certain period of time. That has a lot of complicated aspects, which I can go into if anyone has questions on it. But this is something that they're actively working on right now, and I'd expect to see some sort of rules this year that require stricter regulations for both industry and academic uses. I mentioned before the UN is working on this as well. There are a lot of recurring issues like countries or academic organizations or companies not registering satellites when they launch them, which is required. A lack of coordination between companies or countries. I've heard from some of our operators that they've had a conjunction warning between two satellites, and they've tried to call up another country or company and found out that everyone in the office is on holiday and they can't get through to anyone. So they have to go through very high diplomatic channels to get a hold of anyone for a very time sensitive issue. So trying to figure out how to deal with that issue. There are also no rules on who moves or when they move. So if you have a small satellite that's not worth a lot of money, do you want to use the rest of your fuel to move if you're going to potentially hit a bigger satellite when you don't have as much to lose, but they have a lot to lose? That's definitely a question. And as I mentioned before, there's this big data issue where there are large error bars in where these objects actually are, which makes it, the calculus for who wants to move a difficult question. And then there's some other issues that have come up recently, a couple of years ago. India did an anti-satellite test that created a ton of long-lived space debris on orbit. So there's a question of, should there be some sort of ban on these tests? We didn't think China had done one a while ago that left a lot of space debris on orbit, and we didn't think any country would kind of be stupid enough to do a test like this again, but India did it. And so now there's a lot of diplomatic dialogue about where do we go from here. There was also a company, Swarm, that launched without an FCC authorization. The FCC wouldn't let them launch, or didn't give them a license because they had chipsats that they thought were too small to be tracked. But Swarm went ahead and launched with India anyway. And the Indian government sort of thought they had an FCC license and didn't realize they didn't. So that was a big thing that industry never thought would happen. Someone, willfully ignoring this license issue. They got slapped a relatively small fine from the FCC, which we were all surprised by. They continue to exist. I think they learned a lot, but it shows that not everyone wants to engage in these licensing processes. Quickly, I guess one of the last topics I'll talk about before taking questions. Remote sensing regulatory reform was a big issue over the past couple of years. There was finally reform back over the summer. The issue was that it was just really unclear who was getting licenses, why they were getting denied, because there's an interagency group that gets to approve or deny these licenses that includes, a lot of people in the Pentagon. And so while NOAA is the primary licensing entity, if one person in the Pentagon says, no, we don't like this, these licenses can be held up for a long time. And so finally, there was this regulatory reform that split different technologies into tiers that said, if you're tier 1, if this technology exists outside of the US, it's low risk. We pretty much sign the paper, you've got your license right away. There is this second tier where if there are other US systems that have the same technology, we'll make it much easier for you to get a license, but we might tell you not to look in this one area if it's sensitive to the US government. Or tier 3, it's a really new capability. So if it doesn't exist elsewhere, we may put additional restrictions on you for at least 3 years. So companies are very excited about this. We are seeing a lot of companies, starting to license abroad for these new and novel technologies. Like there's a company called ICEYE in Finland that does synthetic aperture radar, which was something that was much harder to license through the US government, but hopefully we'll see most of these companies, migrating to the US now. And I will skip that one so that we have time for questions. If we have questions about 5G later, I can talk about it. I can put this URL in the chat too. I put together a Google Doc of information for students who are interested in getting into the space industry that has everything from organizations you should sign up for, different places to find scholarships or fellowships. So that's all there. I should also make a plug. I am a co-founder of a fellowship called the Z Factor Fellowship, and it's a summer internship program for undergrads from underrepresented communities. And our deadline to apply for that is on Monday. So I'd love to have some of you apply. I'll also drop that link in the chat. You can definitely fill out the application before Monday. Letters of recommendation are optional, so you don't even need those to apply. And I will take questions from here.
Thank you so much, Therese, for that terrific overview of what is going on in the US. You've given us a great comprehensive, and I think as Amy was pointing out, we will put these slides up. So let me just start off with a general question, then we have some questions that were given in advance, and I noticed a few questions in the chat as well. And my question to you is really about, from the perspective of SIA, what are some of the major stumbling blocks internationally that you see that affects the work of your industry players going forward?
That's a really good question. So certainly on the orbital debris one, I mentioned the issues in coordinating internationally and getting everyone on the same page. I mean, even if the US government decides to be more strict on what satellites can launch in terms of disposal and proving technologies before launching to make sure that they will succeed once they're on orbit. That only applies to anyone who wants a US license. So, companies could just move to another country. Another big one is coordination on spectrum issues internationally. The FCC has not always listened to the International Telecommunications Union in implementing different spectrum allocations from new technologies. For satellite in particular, there's a big question now of the FCC's allocated spectrum for 5G that might interfere with weather satellites and significantly impact weather forecasting days in advance. And then, a bunch of issues regarding what could be perceived as military actions in space, whether that's intentionally creating debris, or things like if China is inspecting a US satellite, there's no international law that says how close they can get to a satellite before it's a hostile action. So what does that look like? What does servicing satellites look like? What is actually a threat in space?
Thank you. And so you mentioned China. One of the first questions that we actually got in is from a professor over in, and let me just make sure that I have this question correctly, but it's really about the threat the threat narrative about China and what that represents for the new space race between the United States and China. In the past, let me read the question to you, Therese, and then you can answer whatever part you want. In the past decade, with an increasing number of ambitious and successful space launching missions by China, the US mainstream media have been presenting these as a threat to the dominance of the United States in space. Is China really a worthy equal competitor or adversary of the US space industry at present, or capable of being in the near future? Why or why not? And is this any different from the overall anti-Chinese political rhetoric in the US foreign policy? I guess you can answer that with respect to the satellite industry that you are helping to push policy forward on.
Yeah, I think China certainly is becoming a worthy adversary. I mean, both in terms of satellite policy, but also human space exploration. I mean, China's pushing really hard to have a lunar base, and there's a lot of question about, if they end up with a base on the far side of the moon, what security implications that will have for the US. And I personally believe that this is why NASA has also been pushing for the moon. There's some DoD interest as well to have a base around the moon for national security reasons. China, I mean, also has the ability to jam or spoof communication satellites and GPS satellites. So China has a policy called the Assassin's Mace, where they are willing to take out any technology that might be superior to theirs, including GPS technology. So they may very substantially disrupt GPS. And they have their own constellation now called Beidou that they actually built faster than the Europeans, even though they were supposed to be part of the European Galileo collaboration initially. They sort of stole some of their technology, decided to do it faster, but they're not reliant on GPS anymore. And they're actually trying to sell their services with that location technology to other militaries that might ally with them. And then also on the remote sensing aspect, I've heard that China has, effectively stolen a lot of secrets on building remote sensing satellites that, at least commercial remote sensing satellites from the US, they've stolen technology to do that. I've heard they have the technology to build planet satellites. And the real question there is, if they have the technology, what's the US value add? Right now, that seems to be, we have better data analytics, but will that always be true? And especially in this era of disinformation, Will they be able to fake remote sensing imagery that, could then end up on a news site and say the US has committed these war crimes somewhere, and then, everyone internationally gets really upset about it. But maybe we can disprove that in a couple of weeks, but will anyone listen? What will the impact of something like that be? So I could see some sort of disinformation campaign being a big issue in the next few years too.
Great answers. And so let me also just say that you were saying earlier that the Biden administration, incoming Biden administration, is likely to stay the course in terms particularly of some areas, and sounds like defense and security. Space defense and security might be one of those areas where it continues. Now, I have a bunch of other questions, Therese. I'm going to read them out to you. I don't know if you can actually see them, but I'll just go down the line. This is a question from Daniel Porras. If the National Space Council remains intact, is there anything industry would like to see changed about how NSC operates? Yeah, that'd be great.
That's a good question. I think it's been really effective so far. And when we've engaged with the National Space Council, they've been very open to feedback. I think they really have good representation from across the federal government, but maybe broader participation in the advisory groups would be helpful. But I really do hope it still remains intact.
Great. I have a question here from Stan Scholl, and it is about is the C-band transfer basically complete now from a US regulatory perspective, given that the operators have ordered replacement satellites and the C-band auction has occurred, or are there still more regulatory issues still in play?
From a regulatory perspective, it's pretty much complete. I mean, the transfer process still has to happen. But I don't think there's much else to do from the regulatory perspective. For our operators, I think there's still, some obviously technical coordination to be done between satellite companies and terrestrial operators to minimize interference, though.
Okay. Great. Here's also a question from Siegfried Egel. Is the new space policy directive regarding space nuclear power and propulsion compatible with the Outer Space Treaty articles, e.g. the ones regarding the stationing of WMDs in space? What are the chances of this particular space policy directive to be reversed by the new administration?
I don't think it'll be reversed by the new administration. I mean, NASA already uses nuclear power in space for propulsion. And there's nothing in the Outer Space Treaty that bans nuclear power. I mean, as long as it's not in the form of a WMD. The reason recently the Department of Energy was brought on board to the National Space Council, and that was because of their nuclear propulsion research. So I think that will continue. And obviously the administration will have to be careful about, how it uses nuclear propulsion in space, and making sure that nothing is perceived as a weapon.
Okay. Thank you, Therese. I have a question here from Jessica Rogers. Is there any current or expected development of regulations to prevent dual use risks in the space sector?
That's a very good question. Not direct. I mean, I wouldn't say there are directly beyond export control regulations. So companies have to be really careful about, having only US citizens work with very sensitive technology. But otherwise, it's really, open for individual countries to determine what could be perceived as a weapon, what couldn't, and work diplomatically to ensure that their actions in space aren't being perceived as hostile actions by other actors.
Yeah, I think that's where the work is sort of headed for almost all spacefaring countries. You're going to like this question about ITAR, Therese, but if companies will be able to function on a more international platform, including the ones that you are working with, do you estimate that there will soon be more opportunities for international graduates that are currently restricted by ITAR? Yeah,
I would say absolutely. I mean, we're seeing the internationalization of space companies, right now, and a large number of actors getting into the space industry that haven't been there traditionally. I know there's supposed to be additional export control reform sort of lined up in the US government. And that was something the Space Council was interested in. Hopefully it's still of interest to the Biden administration. But just internationally, a huge number of companies that are starting to locate elsewhere. And off-the-shelf components being used regularly, even by US companies. It shouldn't be export controlled. And then some of the more downstream applications as well, like remote sensing data analytics, are often not export controlled.
Okay, great. Everybody's always interested in ITAR, despite all the reforms that continue to go on with ITAR. I have a question here from James Penna. The question is, as commercial activity increases in space, will transactions and commerce continue to follow current regulations on domestic trade, such as interstate regulations, Department of Commerce and FTC regulation, or is there talk about developing policies, including trade, that account for the unique nature of in-space commerce? In other words, a whole different set of regulations.
That's also a very good question.
Yeah.
I think, the view is that the transactions and commerce right now will probably follow current regulations on domestic trade that exist. But developing trade policies that account for the unique nature of space technologies is something that's come up as a very futuristic issue. And that was actually part of the discussion when there was debate over where space traffic management would fall in the US government. There was a reasonable argument that it should belong in the Office of Space Commerce because they would be the ones to regulate space commerce. Should companies end up with different bases on the moon, who was going to regulate that? Office of Space Commerce would logically take that. So why not also give them the space traffic management role if they would have this regulatory oversight in the future?
Yeah. Depends on how all that in-space commerce develops going forward, and what kind of, I guess, coordination it also requires at the international level. So great. I have a question here from Eric Magno. Does SIA believe that the establishment of the Space Force will, in general, be positive or negative for the growth of the space industry? And again, you can answer this with respect to the satellite industry.
I'll say we haven't formally taken a position on it because we wanted to see how the rollout has worked. And there are a lot of moving pieces still. But I would say the general industry opinion is that it is a good thing overall. Just because when a lot of the space functions were buried in the Air Force or split across a bunch of different government agencies, it was hard to get people to focus on different space programs. If the Air Force was given a pot of money, they might use it to buy a lot of F-35s, but not really think about launching new satellites. But with the Space Force separately carved out, I think there is hope that there will be more emphasis on really what's critical infrastructure in space, whether it's satellite technologies or other space assets. So I think it will be good overall. I mean, especially also having devoted offices to work on the development of this new technology will be helpful.
Great. I'll wait for other questions, but while we're waiting, I wonder if I can ask you to reflect on, you mentioned the critical space infrastructure, which I think is exactly correct. And since we're so reliant at every level, civilian, commercial, military, on space assets, what is the role that you see SIA sort of playing in helping to ensure the peaceful and sustainable uses of outer space? I mean, I understand you're a trade association, but a significant part of your portfolio is affected by how the stable uses of outer space are promoted. So are you playing a role in that? And if you could maybe discuss that a little bit.
Very much so. Great question. One area that's been a huge focus for us has been space sustainability recently. And we came up with as an association, and we require unanimity to put anything out. So all 50 companies have to sign on. We put out very high level principles of space safety. We put out information on what we thought the future of space and space traffic management would look like. Really trying to get everyone in industry to be on the same page on issues that government hasn't yet really spoken on. Right. Because we think cooperation on space sustainability is really important. And not only do we want our actors to be on the same page, but we're hoping that other actors will use this as a model as they're thinking about what they're doing in space, if they're a company or if they're a regulator thinking about regulation. We're also really involved with response to disasters. So whether that's from a communication side, really working with the FCC in the US, but also with international governments to make sure there are communications available on the ground. And then also our remote sensing members are very involved in disaster response as well, whether that's from forecasting or from monitoring international disasters and doing things like mapping roads and trying to help groups figure out how to get aid into different areas. Very involved there.
Fantastic. And does SIA have international partners that you normally work with on these issues, or are you primarily just doing this internally in the United States?
Usually we would go through a US government agency first. So the State Department has put us in contact with delegations from different countries on certain issues, or for disaster response, the FCC had us put together information for, like, let's say a group of Caribbean government officials on hurricane response. So usually go through the US government first on that.
Fantastic. I guess I'll just ask a final general question. I'd love to hear your viewpoint about this, but what's your wish list for the incoming Biden administration from the perspective of SIA?
That's a good question. So I would certainly say, and I would hope the National Space Council does remain intact, and the Office of Space Commerce still ends up at an elevated level. We're certainly hoping for more coordination on spectrum issues across the federal government. There was a lot of turnover in this administration before the last World Radio Communications Conference, where all the different regulators come together and different parts of the government, the FCC and the NTIA, which represented DoD, were not on the same page, and it was very chaotic. So hoping there's more coordination there. Hoping that we can also work with the government to get broadband to, I think it's something like 15 million people who still don't have broadband access in the US, and wanting to figure out, how to provide satellite cover the entire continental US and could provide service to everyone in the country, but there are often regulatory obstacles to doing so. The FCC has traditionally penalized satellites when they're offering service, well, when they're trying to compete for funding to provide service in comparison to terrestrial operators. So hopefully, we can help figure that out and provide service to a lot of other people. I think commercial remote sensing looks pretty promising right now. We'll see how the regulatory reform plays out and if licensing is gets easier. And I would say export control reform is something that I hope they focus on as well, just to make sure that off-the-shelf technologies are not export controlled, keeping companies competitive, and then also enabling us to bring in international partners to help build the US space industry.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Therese. I really appreciate also, I think we all do at Spark, the fellowship information that you have sent for students. Thank you so much. I believe that there are no other questions, but I want to thank you very much for taking the time to coming and talking to us today. Hopefully you will come back in the future as well. And we certainly have students who may be willing to get in touch with you and to work with you in these fellowships and programs. Thank you so much for joining.
And I just put my email in the chat if anyone wants to reach out to me. So
thank you so much.
Yep, thanks
Great
a lot.
Pleasure to have you with us.
Yep, you too.
And Therese, will we be able to post your slides as well
Yes, I can send those your way.
Okay, fantastic. So we will get those up as well. So thank you so much.
Okay,
Thank you.
thanks a lot.
Thank you,
You're great.
everyone, for joining us. Are we done here?
Yes.